Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Here it is, Friday night, 9 p.m. Central Standard Time, which would be 10 o'clock Eastern and 7 o'clock West Coast time. I want to thank you for joining me for, again, yet another reading from my book, The Exodus Reality. And this is a book that I co-authored with my good friend John Ward, who is an archaeologist, a British archaeologist, living and working in Luxor, Egypt, south of Luxor. He and his wife, Dr. Maria Nilsson, who is the, yes, phaser set to stun, June. There you go. It's right there hanging on the wall. That's a working model, by the way. So I have to keep from not backing into it. It's a working prop model, let's put it that way. And so John and Maria, his wife, she is Dr. Maria Nilsson. She is the chief mission director of their site at Gebel El Silsila, which is about an hour south of Luxor, where they have a home. And what they do is they've got a site at Gebel El Silsila, which is an old quarry site. And I've been there many times. And that quarry site is where all through the let me just turn my mic a little bit. Pardon me if there's any extra noise. It's where they quarried stone all through the dynastic period, pre-dynastic period, and into the last 2,000 years, as well as even modern day. They pull stone out of there. But the Ministry of Antiquities has protected the historical site. So that's where they are. And it was John and I that decided to write this book together because we had our two different views on who we felt Moses was. And by way of recap, John's guy is a fellow by the name of Amenhotep, son of Hapu, who was the high priest, the grand vizier, and under the reign of Amenhotep III, and whose son, by the way, very famous son, was Akhenaten, or Amenhotep IV. And so that sets the time period for you. And about 80 to 90 years earlier is my candidate for Moses, a guy named Senenmut, who was Grand Vizier to the Pharaoh Hatshepsut, the female Pharaoh. And he disappeared about the time she died, around age 40, and there is no mention of whatever happened to him. But he left behind 2 empty tombs. Well, empty at least of his mummy. And although there were other mummies found in there that were just in stacks and thrown down shafts and things like that. And so you can go visit those tombs today. His one tomb is right outside Hatshepsut's temple of Deir el-Bahri, down in the stone where the cliffs rise up off the gully. And so those are our two candidates. My candidate, I pretty much stuck to since this is a biblical tale, I wanted to take the biblical story and see if there was historical efficacy and merit to the tale from a historical point of view. Now, I did not filter my history through the Bible story. I did the opposite. I wanted to step outside that biblical box and look back in and say, is this story, does it meet the criteria of history? And so that's what I did. Now, John's theory with Hapu is more of a theory that's very biblical minimalist. And if you were here for the other readings, you would know that he puts the blame for what has been termed the Exodus, what became known as the Exodus, on the destruction of the city of Thebes by the breaking of the walls of Lake Malkata, the big 1.5 by mile wide sacred man-made lake that was filled at least 30 feet deep with Nile water. And when the walls broke, it flooded the city of Thebes and created a catastrophe, which John believes is something that was the basis for the 10 plagues stories that rose up out of it. And also Amenhotep, son of Hapu, taking and leading people out to safety, thereby creating a mass exodus of people from the Thebes area. Now, he believes that this all took place down in Thebes. I believe it took place up in Memphis, which is 400 miles north, up south of Cairo, up in the Delta area. And there's a lot of evidence for that as well. So in the book, just again as recap, we present our cases in opposing chapters back and forth after that initial material in the first few chapters. And when we do that, we call it the Hapu thread is John's, and the Senenmut thread is mine. And James, good to see you, brother. And Suze, good to see you. June, I already said hi to you. Hopefully we'll have some buildup of people coming. Hopefully we maintain our connection tonight. We had a nice Rip Storton thunderstorm coming rolling through here a little while ago, just before sunset, which is, well, I think the sun is just about down now. And so we had heard of hail and things like that a little west of us. So we furled up and battened the hatches down. And so hopefully things will stay calm enough that we don't have any power outage. Remember, I'm out in the country. So we're in a small town in the country. So there we go. Jeannie, how you doing? Good to see you. And so that was the recap of the book itself. Now, folks, as you know, and I'm going to give this little technical note, I have been working on setting up software. And at the rate I'm going, it's not going to happen before we're done reading this book, but I'm trying. The software I have is something that will allow me to show photos in here, allow me to do many other things with the production of this video while I'm even in live mode. And so I think you'll enjoy it once I get it going. I tried a couple of tests this afternoon. We were having problems with sound, audio, and a couple of other things. So it looks pretty, but so far it's still not quite ready. So I'm broadcasting live via YouTube right now. And it will be that way until we get things figured out. Hey, Gemma, how you doing? And let's see, I had to search. I didn't get a notice. I don't know why the notices aren't going out. I select it to, and if you've clicked on the bell when you subscribed, you're supposed to be getting notifications. And I know Jeff's show has the same thing. Rocky's The Situation Room has the same problem. People aren't just aren't getting their notifications. So that's all on YouTube's side of things. Not sure what we can do to improve that. So I'm glad you came looking, Jeannie. If you ever wonder, just come over to my channel, Mr. Scotty Roberts, Mister Scotty Roberts. And there should always be, when I'm doing a show, a graphic up there saying what time the show is going to start airing. So, and I put that up usually, I think I put one up today about 5.5 hours ago. So it's always up there. You can always find me. And if you can't, go to my Facebook. You can find it on my Facebook. I always put an announcement up there in a post as well. So I don't know. I don't know what it is. Maybe YouTube is a little overrun and they can't get those notifications out. I don't know what it is. So, but I appreciate your being here. And Jeannie, thanks for doing your best to try to find us. So I appreciate that. And so without much more yakety yak and blether, let me get into this. This is a long chapter. This is 30 pages a chapter tonight. Now, some of you may have heard some of this material before. And the reason I say that is I've done a couple of broadcasts on Senenmut. I talked about the Senenmut Connection, which was an excerpt from this book, and I used that as the basis for some talking points, and I read through that in something a few weeks ago. And also, I talked about some of the ghostly experiences, the visions and the things like that I've experienced. And let me say, I have to put this caveat in there. While I believe I had some visions related to all of this material, I'm not given to that kind of stuff. I believe it's real, and I believe there are people it happens to. It just doesn't happen to me. So when it happened to me, I was dubious, to say the least. And now I've kind of grown to accept that that's what it was for several different reasons and several factors. So, oh, and may I say, if you can like this video and go ahead and share it out there, would sure appreciate it. Get some more people coming on in. And what I am finding is that a lot of people, if they can't make it live, they are going back to the archives. And I do, on my main page and my video page, have sections in my here in my YouTube where you can go in and you can listen to the archives and watch the archives. So there you go. Let's see. Anybody else wandering while I was talking? I don't see anybody. So I'm doing fine, by the way, Jama. And I feel a little tired tonight. Something behind my eyes. I don't know if it's, I never had allergies when I was a kid, but I get them now as an adult. And with the spring has sprung and it's starting to get humid and we're having thunderstorms. It's getting hot. It was right around 90 degrees today. And, which isn't as hot as it gets, but the humidity starts to build up. Start to feel it a little bit. So, I'm wearing a different t-shirt tonight. And June, if you didn't catch this earlier, those Think hoodies that I wear, I have about a dozen of those. So anybody who thinks I just throw on the same shirt every day, wrong. I got about 12 of those babies hanging in my closet, left over from our Paradigm Symposium days. So I throw those on every now and then. Now that it's getting warm, I'm not wearing hoodies anymore. So I start wearing shirts and t-shirts. And I don't wear t-shirts a lot, but every now and then. I got some of my own coming in from Son of a Patriot. And I do have my Son of a Patriot shirt. So, yeah, spring sinus sneeze, itch breathing, exactly. Barometric pressure, all of that stuff. All right, let's go. Let's get into this chapter. Some of this matter you've heard before, as I said. And I may have read, I took an excerpt from this chapter and posted it on my academia site. And I read from that a few weeks back, doing a side thread commentary on Senenmut. And so some of this you'll recognize, but I think it'll still be fun. Do a little more commentary here tonight. All right. Chapter 7, Senenmut. And this is, of course, part of the Senenmut thread, one of my chapters. Ra took the form of a pink blazing ball rising heavily in the east, the humid air bending his shafts, dappling the high trunks of palm forest with an odd blend of gold and pink. The foliage was a blaze of yellow and warm green, the colors saturated by the moisture in the air, and the dew-laden palm fronds hung low before the mud brick houses in Goshen as the soldiers approached. I'm just looking to see Suze. I'm really loving my blue light glasses. My eyes much better and falling to sleep better. That's good. Fantastic, Suze. Let's see. Yeah, I should have some coffee right now, and I didn't get any made, James. So the morning's dew was thick and the ground was wet, as if there had been rain throughout the night, but the skies were clear, and there was no sign of rain to come. The earth here in the Nile Delta seemed to water itself, and all the world was lush and green. As the sun cleared the horizon, the soldiers of Pharaoh had already begun their house-to-house canvass. Now, by the way, if you think about it, if you think of Egypt as being all desert, it's not. It's desert down the Nile to the south. And there's desert in the north, to be sure, but the Nile Delta region, pretty fertile, pretty green, pretty wet. So there you go. The mandate was clear, and despite the unpleasant nature of the task at hand, it had to be obeyed to the letter. Gathering small children and sacrificing them to Sobek in the waters of the Nile was a damned bloody affair. But everyone understood why it needed to be done. And these children were, after all, only the offspring of a subdued, enslaved people who, if they could, would join forces with other foreigners and overthrow Tutmosis I, the pharaoh of the recently reunited Upper and Lower Egypt. He was Tutmosis' grandfather, Ahmose I, who had cleared this region of the foul Hyksos people and placed into forced labor those who were defeated and had not fled the country. Now their grandsons and granddaughters were born to the task of building Pharaoh's cities and making the mud brick that was distributed throughout the region and the rest of Egypt. As the general edict was carried out, the cries of babes and the mournful wailing of mothers was heard throughout the streets and pathways, echoing off the walls of the houses of the Hebrews. Had not they served their Pharaoh well? Why would he bring such devastation upon their families? Had not the children of Jacob borne the weight of building Egypt upon their backs? And now their reward was the stealing and murder of their children. The Pharaoh's edict was detailed in Exodus 1:22. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. You can clearly imagine these Israelite mothers crying out to their Egyptian gods, "O mistress of the West, hear our cry. O joyous Hathor, great mother, receive our children as they fly to you for refuge from this life. O great I Am, deliver us from this sorrow. Turn the face of Pharaoh away from his seething anger with us, and save our children from generation to generation." Now, of course, that's a little fictionalized event that I've written about there. It was the best way, I think, to express the pathos of the moment. I also think that the Hebrews, the Israelites, were, well, I know they weren't Jewish because the Jewish religion had not yet been established, because it's Moses who, after the Exodus, codifies Judaism for the first time. Now, they had a Judaic form of religion, an Abrahamic religion. But I think they also, by virtue of the way they acted as a people after the Exodus, were very Egyptianized. They probably worshipped Egyptian gods, as is evident when they go to Aaron, Moses' brother, while they're out in the wilderness, and said, "Build us a god." And he builds them the golden calf, who is none other than Hathor, the calf or cow goddess of Egypt. And so I think that this is very well established in these verses and in the incidents that took place. Michelle, how you doing? Good to see you. Yes, and evening from a stormy Wisconsin. Just about next door to you here, Michelle. So now, this act that Pharaoh commits, is this a precedent for tyranny? Without question, any official royal edict ordering the murder of innocent children is the act of a tyrant. So what sort of man would commit such an atrocity? Is there any historical precedent in Egyptian history for such an act of inhumanity? One of the elements of Moses' story told in the book of Exodus is the details surrounding his birth. According to the scriptural account, the Pharaoh is concerned about the population of the Hebrews, in that they have grown too numerous. So he issues an edict that all the baby boys should be thrown into the Nile River and drowned. The big questions are these: what would drive a monarch to order such a thing? Was it enforced by his soldiers, or was this something that he put out there as a public proclamation to be carried out by all Egyptians? Is there any archaeological data that might confirm any pharaoh doing such a thing? Is this simply the first of many pogroms invoked against the Hebrews, as understood through a Jewish perspective? Well, at least in this case, the children of Israel, as Judaism per se, did not exist at this time in their history. By way of historical comparison, we can look on the mandates carried out by the English king in Scotland after the famous Battle of Culloden Moor in 1746. Bonnie Prince Charlie, as he was called, was the rightful heir to the throne of Scotland, and he had gathered thousands of Highland men and raised an army to defend his claim. On April 16th of 1746, Charlie and his Highland army met the superior forces of Lord Cumberland in a decisive open battle on the moors of Culloden outside Inverness, Scotland. The Highlanders were utterly defeated, and the Highland clan system was forever eradicated in Scotland as a potential governing force. In the months that followed, King George instituted the Highland Clearance, or clearances. On penalty of death, the Highland Scots could not speak their Gaelic language, wear the tartan or the kilt, or stay in their homes. They were all cleared out of the Highlands, resulting in the slaughter of innocents, families, and children as a result. Highlanders were given the option of conscripting to the king's armies, or in many cases, death by sword or at the end of a rope. Pardon me, my throat is very scratchy tonight. This resulted in the forming of the Scottish regiments in the British Army, and eventually led the resurgence of a more romanticized notion of the Scottish Highlander during the Victorian period. But the original mandate of clearance and death, though heinously conceived, was at the core. Although it's not perfect as a demonstrative illustration, the plight of the Highland Scots is a similar historical reference to a civilized monarch issuing very uncivilized edicts for the good of his people, or at least the good of his political aims. Could Thutmose I have been in a similar situation when he issued a mandate based on his perception of what might be the best for his people? Was the killing of children necessary to maintain his kingdom and ensure its prolonged safety? As mentioned previously, it was Thutmose's grandfather who, in the last 10 years of his reign, completely cleared out the Hyksos peoples and bound the living remnant into forced labor and slavery. Now the enslaved people were growing in numbers. Nearly 2 generations later, their exponential breeding had unwittingly put them in harm's way, as the pharaohs saw them as a potential rising threat. Take another look at the biblical passage that details all of this, and keep in mind that the scripture does not delineate between successive pharaohs. On the following pages, you will see passages from Exodus 1 through 22, detailing the deeds of multiple pharaohs, despite the text making no distinction, delineation, or mention of their names. Now in Exodus 1, it says, "These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increasing in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them." And this is in Egypt. Yo, Rocky, how you doing, brother? Rocky's in the room. Shut up. Let's see. Audrey says, "Appetite for Destruction is the greatest album ever." Okay, you're on something totally different there, but that's okay. I just thought you were referring to this. So let's see. Nice, Audrey. Great Guns N' Roses tune. Okay, this is obviously none other than Amos the First. Oh, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. And Joseph's people, the clan of Israel, multiplied over the next generations, filling the land with their family blood. The Hebrews proliferated throughout the reign and were obvious blood allies to the Hyksos king, who was also of Asiatic descent. It says in verse 8 of Exodus 1, "Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt." Now remember, we recapped some of this in previous chapters as well. This is obviously none other than Amos the First. He's this new king who comes to power. And he rose to power in the south on the Theban throne and reclaimed northern Egypt by repeatedly attacking and breaking the Hyksos hold on lower Egypt in the north and the Nile Delta. The biblical text says, depending on which translation you read, that this Pharaoh rose to power and knew not Joseph. Or better interpreted as, he couldn't have cared less about who Joseph had been, as he was a political appointee of a ruler whom he believed to be an invading, illegitimate usurper. So he wiped them out and reclaimed the throne of Lower Egypt in the north, reuniting the kingdoms under his rule. Now here, I don't know if I showed you this picture. And again, I got to hold up my book because my software is not set up yet. Still struggling with it. That's me. This is up in Memphis. And that's some of the ruins. It's mud brick ruins that have just disintegrated over the years. And they're filled with little bits of pottery and all kinds of antiquities sticking out of it. And so we were wandering through the debris field here in Memphis, Egypt. It was very warm and very humid. So there you go. All right, let's move on. Yes, it's very tall grass. I don't know if you can see it. I don't know if it's clear on here or not. But the color picture, of course, shows this much better. But there you go. I'll try to hold that still. There you go. You can see where we are. Palm trees, tall grass, mud brick structures that are just melting away over thousands of years of erosion and rain and weather. Hey, TT, how you doing? And Audrey, I don't think I ever said hello to you. Audrey, are you saying I have no sound? You said, is my sound on? Check your mute. Lewis. Oh, you're talking to Lewis. Okay. And Lewis, can you hear me? All right. Audrey, I haven't done anything. You saying that's better? Thank you, you said. You're all good, Cannoli. Fantastic. All right. I thought so. I was having sound problems with the testing of my software this afternoon. Now I'm just Rocky. Yeah. Here, let me lick them for you. There, how's that? Are they glowing? Are they glossy enough for you? So, meow, he says. All right. So, let's move on. Verse 9 in that same chapter says, "Look, this Pharaoh who knew not Joseph or cared not about Joseph, said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, they'll join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country in shambles," I think is the idea there. So Amos imposed slavery over the remnants of the Hyksos as well as any other Asiatics who may have aligned with them on the basis of heredity or heritage. The Hyksos were, after all, from the Syrian and Canaanite region, the homeland of the family of Israel, to whom he had granted much favor. This family of Hebrews then became a problem for the conquering Theban Pharaoh from the south. He saw them as a blight, as foreigners, and as a people who, because of their blood ties to the Hyksos rulers, would be first in line to sign on for any fight to reclaim the Memphite throne. He needed to nip this potential military political issue in the bud. And there I got Rocky all excited just there. So, verse 11, they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. The issue of the cities of Pithom and Ramses have been a problem in the dating of the entire story. As mentioned earlier, these were cities that did not exist by those names until after the reign of Ramses II. And he's the Ramses, you see, Yul Brynner played Ramses, who was a Joel, what's his name, in the Ridley Scott movie, Exodus, Gods and Kings. They all use Ramses, and it's because of this verse that says the Hebrews built the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses, which were built by Ramses II. So, what's the real story here? The later writers, rewriters, and scribal editors of the original book of Exodus merely updated those city names with what would have been recognized by the populace reading the book in their day. 1,000 years later, it would be as if I was writing about the mid-19th century Minnesota village named after the infamous bootlegger Pierre Pig's Eye Perrant. Very few people, even living today in Minnesota, would know of the little town named Pig's Eye, although there was a Pig's Eye beer brewed in St. Paul. But they would most certainly recognize the same town by its latter name of St. Paul, the capital of the state of Minnesota. So Pithom and Ramses, or Pi Ramses, were the later names of the cities built and revitalized under Amos I, who incorporated the slave labor of the northern Hyksos people he had just conquered. Amos I was a voracious builder, at Avaris, later known as Pyramses, with visions of establishing this city as a possible commercial center in the north. He also left a pyramid with this cenotaph, a memorial as opposed to a tomb at Abydos. So now in verse 12 of Exodus 1, but the more they were oppressed, the Hebrews, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites, and they worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar, and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. Now, the very mention of the Hebrews' ability to proliferate and grow, spread in population, is an indicator of the passage of time, and at least a generation, maybe even two. Pardon me, my mic is all out of alignment here. So the Pharaoh who slapped the Hebrews into bondage is not the same Pharaoh who attempted to stunt their continued proliferation. See how the later Pharaoh attempts to deal with the problem. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Sifra and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys alone. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? And the midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They're vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Now, you can see how cultural all of that is, too, by the way. So, here we have the introduction of a new Pharaoh, who I believe is Pharaoh Tutmosis I, different from the Pharaoh who first subjugated the Hebrews. I find it interesting that Moses, or perhaps the later editions of the book of Exodus, found it unnecessary to mention the names of the pharaohs, but included the names of seemingly insignificant midwives. Is this a deliberate slap in the face to the eternal nature of the pharaohs and their quest for historical immortality? Or is it simply homage paid to legendary characters? In the rise of the Hebrew people while degrading the pharaoh by making his eternal name of less import than that of lowly slave midwives. There we go. Wow, Louis, cannoli on the big screen sounds cool. Thanks. All right. What are y'all watching over at Lewis's house tonight? All right, here we go. Verse 22, when Pharaoh gave his order to all his people, every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Let's see. Jama says, I once read that the Israelites guarded the northeast of Egypt in Goshen, and that they were well trained and armed, and some went to Asia in the Exodus and became the samurai, being a form of Samaria. You know, I've heard some of those things too. That's worthy of a study all on its own. I think I'd like to do that, write a little research on that. That's good observation, good input, Jam. I appreciate that. And Lewis has got popcorn, folks, so go on over. Let's see. It's interesting that Tutmosis I made his wishes known to all his people, not just to the army. He wanted the Hebrews eradicated, and he was speaking to the national pride of the Egyptian people. He was calling upon all of them to do away with the male babies, who would grow into soldiers and possibly revolutionaries who remembered their blood ties to the deposed Hyksos, as well as the harsh treatment with which the pharaohs treated their people. It is the genocidal actions of Tutmosis I that led to his own royal daughter, Hatshepsut, becoming the young woman who found and raised Moses as her own, elevating him as the Hyksos. King elevated Joseph to a position of power and authority, and possibly even a bid for the throne of Egypt. Though the Oxford chronology of the pharaohs places Tutmosis' reign dates from 506 BC to 1492 BC, there has been considerable scholarship done by a minority of Egyptologists that believe there was a miscalculation in the astrological timelines used to establish his reign. It is believed that they used a Memphian timeline as opposed to the Theban timeline. Now remember, John and I, in our different views, he believes the Exodus all took place down from Thebes, which is current-day Luxor, 400 miles south of Memphis and Cairo. I believe it took place up there in the Nile Delta region, in Goshen and Memphis. There may have been a discrepancy in the calendar due to the Memphian timeline as opposed to the Theban timeline, thereby setting his reign back about 20 years to approximately 1526 BC to 1513 BCE. This is a significant difference, not so much in numbers of years, as a 20-year discrepancy is minor compared to all the shiftings of reign dates represented in all the chronologies of the pharaohs that seem to slide haphazardly back and forth on the veritable whim of archaeological discovery. But without being too technical, the Sothic year is basically a 365-day year that followed the annual rising of Sirius, the Egyptian name for the Greek star Sothis. A Sothic cycle then became 1461 ancient Egyptian years, whereas a Julian year, what we use today, was 1460 years, one day less, calculating on a solar year that it is 365.25 days long, accounting for what we call the leap year, one of every four. The rising of Sothis occurred within a month or so of the annual Nile flooding, which was of great importance to the agricultural society of ancient Egypt, and marked by the beginning of the new Sothic year. But depending on whether you were taking your readings of Sothis from Memphis up in the Delta or from Thebes in the desert south, that would determine the calendar date. Determining the precise date of any particular rise of Sothis Sirius is incredibly difficult, especially in light of the fact that you need to know the precise latitude of where the observation was made. The Egyptian calendar loses one day every 4 years, and the rise of Sothis or Sirius will take place on the very same day every year for 4 years in a row. The problem arises in that any observation recorded of that rise of Sothis Sirius can date to any one of those 4 years within that cycle. See, it starts to get a little technical here, but this is how you decipher the dating systems, making the observation of that rising not overtly precise. And that's why the chronologies of the kings of Egypt can tend to jump all over the place. Remember, there's 4 of them, and a 5th done by an independent Egyptologist, which was David Roll. Of the 3 observations of the Sothis star used to calculate years, the 3rd was during the reign of Amenhotep I, the father of Tutmosis I. Assuming this observation was made in Thebes, the dates of Amenhotep I's reign were established as happening between 1525 and 1504 BCE. However, if this same observation was made in Memphis, Heliopolis, or some other delta site, the entire chronology of the 18th dynasty needs to be shifted back by some 20 years. But there's a lot of dispute over this among scholars. So you see, even the scholars don't always get it right all the time. Sometimes the alignment of the stars in correspondence to the geographical location where that alignment was observed and cataloged for the purpose of establishing a critical date becomes a subject of debate. And when you align that with the notion that ancient books compiled into the Bible should not be used to establish verifiable facts in history, you can start to see the scholarly debate igniting even further. If there's one thing we can expressly sink into your minds, it is that just because something is contained within a book of faith, that should not preempt it from consideration in establishing historical facts. The writers of Scripture may have had a spiritual teaching in mind, but that does not mean their events were complete fabrications. And as we've already seen in this book, and as we shall continue to see, continue to demonstrate, biblical stories can be the basis for establishing veracity, especially when balanced against first-hand and second-hand archaeological data. When you can establish plausibility, you can begin to eradicate the notion that the information is untrustworthy. And make no mistake, there are many who begin their research having an established bias that the biblical accounting is simply myth, fable, or inaccurate on the basis of its inherent spirituality. Keep in mind that the Egyptians did the very same thing. When they recorded the deeds of a pharaoh, they simply did not include the mundane, the humiliating, and the defeats. Everything was either turned into a positive exemplification of that pharaoh's accomplishments or a completely whitewashed picture of his deeds. So when we align what appears to be biblical legend and myth with only superficial accounts of the pharaohs and their times, we need to dig deeper into what we've already identified as secondary evidence. Of course, all of this ancient exploration is based on what we think we know at any given time. And to place all of our answers on external archaeological sources is to discredit the writers of the Old Testament books as pure fabricators rather than people who had some clue as to what they were talking about. Further, the constant wrangling, argumentativeness, and finger-pointing within the Egyptological and archaeological communities can give you an idea of just how invested one scholar or the other is in his or her particular theory. There is cocksuredness to many of these researchers and theorists akin to a group of bishops discussing how many angels dance on the head of a pin. The first question needs to be asked, are there angels? The second would be to establish their size and their ability to change shape before one could even begin to determine whether or not they could dance upon a pin's head. And that demonstrates the point that an old adage was attempting to make, as well as the speculative research of academics illustrated in a very different way. What am I missing there? Listening and toddler wrangling is difficult. Nate's not respectful of my Mr. Roberts time. That's the way they are, Michelle. Yeah, every time we take our three kids, 9-year-old boy, 7-year-old girl, 4-year-old girl, out to the store like we did earlier this evening, it's a battle. It's a battle of, did I not tell you this already? Have I not mentioned this every day of your life and every time we've entered a store in the last 7 years of your life? Have we not said this? And yet still you do it. And so we fight. It's constant. This is why Rainey likes to go shopping alone. And I just say, let me watch your kids. Just go. Get out of here. So we don't have to take those kids with us. Because sometimes they're a big pain in the ass. And so, Michelle, I know what you mean about trying to watch your kid and do something proactive for yourself. Every day of my freaking life, Suze. All right, here we go. To directly quote John Ward, we weren't there, we don't know. All we can do is sift through the information and come to the most reasonable deduction of fact. So, Tutmosis I seems to align best with the 1526 to 1513 BC reign dates, especially in light of the other facts that place him in those dates. This dating of his reign is also important to the aligning of biblical chronology with Egyptian chronology. Although history cannot be adjusted to match biblical stories, It can be found through external information, such as dating the chronologies on the calculations made by the Sothis star. Biblical stories can sometimes be aligned with historical data by use of external scientific means that are, in and of themselves, part of the ongoing debate that exists in academia. Oh, good for you, Suze. Your kids are coming. Now, I've always wondered on this. When we talk about the Sothis star and Sirius, um, and then start to put it together with the Christmas story and how the sages, the mages, and the magicians in the East, they call them wise men, saw this star on the night of Jesus' birth, supposedly, as the story goes. And they traveled to Israel. They think it was maybe 2 years later before the wise men actually showed up at Joseph and Mary's door. And it may have been while they were in Egypt. So, what's very interesting here is that, remember, when Herod the Great put out the edict to have all the babies killed for fear of this deliverer, very similar to the Moses story, where did Joseph and Mary pack up and take the family to? Well, to Egypt. Now, I have heard, I gotta tell you, I have heard politicos trying to make hay out of that. You know, Joseph and Mary, they were poor. They needed a place to stay on Christmas night. They also had to travel to Egypt and they had nothing. And so did the government give them a handout, give them a place to stay, take Egyptian tax money and pay for Joseph and Mary and their family to have a home and start a business down in Egypt? I rather doubt it. But I do think that they had a home there. I don't think they walked off with nothing and bought something. I think they had a place to go, because it said they went to Egypt and they stayed there until Jesus was a little older and Herod died. And all this junk was over with. Now, Herod died, I think, in about 4 BC. And so Jesus supposedly was born around 7 to 8 BC by the calendar system. So there you go. They were there for a few years. As a matter of fact, there is a church in Old Cairo, the old district in Cairo, and it's Coptic Christian district. And this old Coptic church still stands there, still practices. We went inside and sat down very quietly during a service. And that church is supposed to be on top of the house that belonged to Joseph and Mary. And this church was established 1,700 years ago. So when you think about tradition, it was tradition already 300 years after the time of Jesus that house was the location of Joseph and Mary's house where Jesus grew up. That was in the 300s, and it still maintains that reputation to this day and still stands as a church. I think that's very interesting. Yeah, Egyptian welfare, Lewis. That's I got on some people's cases who were using that. The Reverend Jesse Jackson once said something about Joseph and Mary being poor and had no place to stay in Bethlehem that night. And I guffaw at that because Joseph was a manual laborer. He was a contractor, if you will. The word used for carpenter is also synonymous with stonemason. So he was a stonemason and a carpenter. And he had a successful business. I think he probably was okay off. I think they just got to Bethlehem and there's no kayak or no Priceline or any of those kinds of websites to set up your hotel visit. So they're going there, and they went there at a time where a census had been called, and it's also Passover. And the towns, all these little towns around Jerusalem were packed to the gills, as they would be every year at Passover, and now also because of the census of Tiberius Caesar, if that was a real thing at all. So when they arrived there and found there was no place to stay, they probably went to a place he'd been to many times. And they said, sorry, man, there is no place. And then he says, look, my wife's going to give birth. And so what does it do? It says they gave him the stay. They said, go to the stable out back. There's a little cave in the stable. Now, it's been established historically that families back then, Their stables and stalls were part of the family house. They weren't a separate structure. So it's very likely that the innkeeper said, "Go to my house out back." And there's a place, and they put him up in the stable, and they made it as comfortable as possible. Baby born, boom. So all that as a side note to, I wonder about this star, the Sothis star, and how it's connected to the wise men. If it is even, if it has the winter solstice is when that star rises. What's that? December 21st. And of course, we think that Jesus would have been born on this around the spring equinox, not solstice, which is in April. And so when that spring equinox takes place, that's right around Passover time. So there's some interesting stuff to start correlating, which I did not do for this book. Makes for a better story than Mary and Joseph were poor. Yeah, that's right. It's a good story, but there's probably not much fact to that story. That's the problem. All right. Let's see where I left off. Let's see. I'm over on this side of the gutter. Of course, all of this ancient exploration is based on what we think we know at any given time. And I think I may have read that already too. Oh, yeah, because I went to John Ward. Now, so you see, there's very little we know for sure. And the thing we think we know for sure oftentimes are upended by newer discoveries or archaeological data that flips an entire notion on its ear. Until there is absolutely no debate or opposing theories on a given subject, there is no absolute certainty. In a court of law, sometimes all you need to establish is a solid circumstantial case, even when hard fact is impossible to establish. A primary factor in establishing Thutmose I's reign date is the notion that it was his daughter, Hatshepsut, who was the young princess that found baby Moses in a basket on the Nile River. And there is a hinge pin date from the pages of biblical chronology that place Moses and Hatshepsut as being together on that muddy Nile bank so long ago. But before we go there, let's take a little more intimate look at the daughter of Pharaoh and how she can be identified as the young princess mentioned in Exodus. So now the section of this chapter, Pharaoh's daughter. It says in Exodus 2:5-10, "Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby, and he was crying, and she felt sorry for him. 'This is one of the Hebrews,' she said. Then his sister, Miriam, who went along, remembered, to make sure the basket was safe. She pipes up and hops out of the bulrushes and asked Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?' 'Yes, go,' she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you.' So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, 'I drew him out of the water.'" As is the modus in historical study, you sometimes need to jump far ahead or far behind any given event to help establish its place in the historical record, not to mention its credibility. In the case of Thutmose I's reign date, as it pertains to his young daughter finding Moses in the basket on the Nile, it's important to understand where the biblical dating system fits into the larger picture of the chronology of the kings of Egypt. Imagine, if you will, a young princess of Egypt named Hatshepsut, which was her regnal name. Her birth name was Matkare. Her chosen name, Prenomen, the daughter to the powerful Pharaoh, who is known for his conquests into Nubia and Canaan, extending the borders of his empire. Her entire existence was one of a pampered life as the royal palaces in both the southern capital of Thebes and Mennefer, the northern capital of Egypt. She grew up surrounded by not only her personal attendants, but by royal servants and tutors who educated her in Egyptian history and cultures of the world. A veritable host of people tended to her every need and watched over her every move and governed her every facet of education. Her father was in the second year of his reign and was continuing not only the expansion of the Egyptian territory to its former glory and beyond, but also the internal campaign against the remnant of the Hyksos, defeated by his grandfather some 2 decades earlier. He recently mandated a public pogrom against the Hebrew slave people by issuing a mandate that all the baby boys were to be cast into the Nile, murdered so that they might not continue to increase in numbers, and again overtake Egypt. It was a heinous measure, but one that he believed was necessary to protect his kingdom from encroachment from within. And this is the atmosphere into which the young Hatshepsut was raised. The people who she was taught to hate by virtue of their heritage and connection to the usurpant Hyksos were the forced laborers of her father, whose children now suffered death by drowning. But she was also, in accordance with what we know about her deeds and accomplishments, a bit of a maverick, one who bucked the system if necessary to attain her personal goals. When she reached the throne, her building campaigns and works of art exceeded that of many other pharaohs, and she made an indelible imprint of her monarchy on Egyptian history. According to Henry Breasted, Thutmose I's only daughter, Hatshepsut, is known as the first great woman in history of whom we are informed. She bore the title of Pharaoh's daughter, being that she was the only royal princess of Thutmose I. But it was her brother Thutmose II who was the rightful heir to the throne of Egypt when their father died. Thutmose II died very early into his reign, leaving a son, Thutmose III, born Jehutimus, crowned as Mentkepere, of a lesser, probably harem wife, and also a young daughter from his sister wife, Hatshepsut, named Nefruri. Hatshepsut contested the ascensions to the throne of her young stepson, Thutmose III, on the grounds that her father had named her an equal successor to the throne with her brother husband, who was now dead. But let's move back to when she was 7 to 10 years old. While out along the riverbank, escorted by her royal entourage, according to the biblical account, which the biblical account also mentions to establish the young woman as the royal princess. On her way to bathing in the river near the palace at Mennefer, she found a basket made of reeds smeared with pitch and tree sap. When she opened the basket, there was a baby boy who her servants immediately identified as a Hebrew child. Hatshepsut went on to claim him as her own, sending him back to her mother to his mother to be weaned until she was old enough and rightful to claim him. No doubt there were other hands in the making of her legal decision, and she most certainly had problems convincing her father that she wanted to raise a Hebrew boy. But there is absolutely no historical record that she interacted with her father on this matter, nor that it ever truly happened. No historical record of this event has ever been found in Egyptian records of the day, and we have already established that not a single scrap of papyrus remains detailing the little affairs of daily life in the Delta region. That will be a phenomenal discovery the day they find any existing papyrus written on by scribes, somehow stored, preserved in the Delta region. There's just none that exist. But Moses did give us a hint as to the identity of his remarkable Egyptian princess when in the book of Exodus he calls her Pharaoh's daughter. We all know that story. Pharaoh's daughter was bathing by the river and found the baby, and Pharaoh's daughter did this and that. This is a hint as to who she is. For Hatshepsut, this was not merely a description of who she was, but a detailed historical clue as to what she was. Pharaoh's daughter was a title bestowed by Tutmosis I on his only daughter, Hatshepsut, Motkare. And so Pharaoh's daughter was a title created by Tutmosis I and distinctly bestowed on his only daughter to identify her by title as Pharaoh's daughter. I think that's very interesting. It's not just Pharaoh's daughter. It's not a description. It's a title. Women of royal birth in the 18th dynasty can be identified by the use of the title King's or Pharaoh's daughter. Since there is no evidence in the 18th dynasty of women who are known to have had non-royal parents being given this title, this rules out the possibility that this title was sometimes awarded to enhance the status of non-royal women. There's a footnote for that. In other words, the little phrase mentioned in Exodus is not just a casual epithet describing any child of the period or even a harem child of Pharaoh. It is the express royal title given only to the heir of the Pharaoh, just as the title of Highness, Majesty, and so on was used for royal children who were direct descendants of kings and queens in European history. But there is some aversion out there, even amongst biblical archaeologists, who filter all history through a scriptural perspective to pinpoint Hatshepsut as the Pharaoh's daughter of the Bible. Dr. Charles Ayling, who was one of my seminary professors, cautions us to be careful to too quickly identify Hatshepsut as the Pharaoh's daughter in the book of Exodus. When I was in my seminary days under the professorship of Dr. Ayling, I presented my theory that Moses was raised by Hatshepsut. So you see, folks, this isn't a new thing for me when I wrote this book 7 years ago. Even back then, and we're talking in the early 1980s, some 30 years ago, the good doctor advised me to use great care because although the facts fit, the story borders on being far too romanticized, and that Moses should be raised by the heir to the throne rather than what was more probable in his view, a harem wife or daughter. With all due respect to my former teacher, who is a great man and a fervent critical thinker, I think the facts are far too strong to deny. Though caution may have us not pinpoint Hatshepsut, many more facts about her reign and later relationship with a man named Senenmut seem to strengthen the case for her being the Pharaoh's daughter of the book of Exodus. Perhaps while omitting the names of all the Egyptian personalities, this is the one homage that Moses makes to the woman who raised him and who represented much, much more, for Pharaoh's daughter could apply to no one other than Hatshepsut, and Moses, when he wrote this, fully knew that. Then it says here this is an inscription from Hatshepsut's temple of Deir el-Bahre, Jesher in Luxor. Then his majesty, Tutmosis I, said to them, "This daughter of mine, Khnumetamun Hatshepsut, may she live. I have appointed as my successor upon my throne. She shall direct the people in every sphere of the palace. It is she indeed who shall lead you. Obey her words, unite yourselves at her command." The royal nobles and dignitaries and the leaders of the people heard this proclamation of the promotion of his daughter, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Motkare. May she live eternally. So remember, Motkare, Hatshepsut, said, "My dad, guys, my husband's dead, my brother, but my dad wanted me to succeed the throne as well." And so this is what she had written. By the way, in the book, there's this gorgeous, colorful oil painting that was done by a friend of mine of Hatshepsut by Julia Cuccia Watts. And she gave me permission to use this in the book, and it's too bad we couldn't print it in color. But this was her rendition of Hatshepsut at the time. Now, I have my own rendition of Hatshepsut as well. You may have seen it if you're on my Facebook page. But this is her sitting on the throne, a woman in a man's place. And she knew it, and she made the most of it. And she kicked some royal ass, we'll put it that way. Now, when Hatshepsut's husband, her royal brother, Tutmosis II, died as a young man during his short reign of only 13 years, the throne passed to his son, Tutmosis III, born of a lesser harem wife, and he was only 2 or 3 years old at the time of his ascension to the throne of Egypt. Hatshepsut was appointed the regent, but she declared herself Pharaoh, never denying that Tutmosis III was a fellow heir to the throne. He never played an active role in the rule of the empire and possessed very little power, as Hatshepsut took on all the responsibilities of the pharaoh in every way. She ruled well, as she believed she was born to take on this role, and she probably, not even probably, you know by history that she was a phenomenal ruler of Egypt. She ruled for like 26 years, I believe it was. 21 to 26 years, in that range. Let's see. Hatshepsut was appointed his regent, but she declared herself pharaoh. He never played an active role in the rule of the empire. She ruled well, as she believed she was born to take on the role, and her reign was marked by prosperity, expansion, and great advancement. And with that came the love and loyalty of the Egyptian people. When Tutmosis III was old enough and had demonstrated to her his capability to command and lead, she even appointed, here's the kid who was 3 when his father died, was the rightful pharaoh, but Hatshepsut, in a sense, deposed him, made herself pharaoh, set him up royally. When he came of age, what do you think he did? Did he lead a rebellion against her? No. But what does she do? This is very telling of the kind of pharaoh and the kind of time of peace they were in. When Tutmosis III was old enough and had demonstrated to her his capability to command and lead, she appointed him the general of all her armies. So here's the guy. He's control of all the armies. One would think that this would be a very precarious position to place a deposed royal sibling, but he apparently thrived under her rule and expressed no dislike of her until after her death, when in a papyrus written as a declaration to his coronation and ascension to the throne in Thebes, he referred to Hatshepsut as that lying, deceitful woman. Now, we'll find out a little later. There's more to this than that. I don't think he held animosity toward her, but there were certain things he had to do to establish his reign after that. So, there seems to be a great dispute over the relationship between Hatshepsut and Tutmosis III. Some say that there exists evidence of a bitter hatred for each other, evidenced by the desecration and removal of all her images from her own temple and every other monument after her death. Other evidence suggests that if there had been such bitterness between them, she would never have appointed him to a position heading her armies, as he who had the heart of the army had the seat of the throne. Regarding the removal of Hatshepsut's images after her death, it's been thought for many years that this was the act of an embittered, hateful Tutmosis III, who had been declared pharaoh when he was a small child. But it appears that much of what he did after her death was simply transforming her buildings and sites into his own, much the way Ramses II did of the city of Avaris, turning them into Pithom and Ramses much later. Hatshepsut had started as his co-regent until he would be of age to take the throne on his own. Yet she declared herself pharaoh and lost my place, and took on all the functionality of the role of the sole male monarch of Egypt, even down to wearing a male king's clothing and the headdress and false beard of the pharaoh. And she held the throne as pharaoh until her death 22 years later. What Tutmos did in his acts of defacement of Hatshepsut's image was to impose his own image and presence over hers, establishing that he was indeed the rightful pharaoh. Now, these are going to be impossible to make out this way, and they're really only visible in the color versions of these photos. But I have here on this page, these are images that were defaced of Hatshepsut by Tutmosis II, or I'm sorry, the third. You can see here it's even the outline of the profile of her face looking that way, this wild helmet she's wearing, headdress, her arms and shoulders, and she's seated on a throne. These are all meticulously chiseled out, artistically chiseled out. All of these different images you can see here. And this is on her temple of Deir el-Bahri at Djeser Jesheru. Now, but newer information has stated that Tutmosis III did not disgrace or remove any of her images, as it's thought that one of Hatshepsut's trusted counselors would have been greatly offended. It was after that counselor's death that her images were removed. And it was not done under the order of Tutmosis III. It was his son, Amenhotep II, who I believe is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, appointed co-regent with Tutmosis during the final 2 years of his reign, who ordered their removal. And what's even more interesting is that at the same time he removed the images of Hatshepsut, he also removes all images of her favored counselor and lover, Senenmut. And this was 40 years after the fact. If Senenmut was perceived to be an obstacle to Tutmosis' rise to power, his eradication was as important as that of Hatshepsut's, especially if Senenmut represented a possible challenge to the throne. Tutmosis III, after the disappearance of Senenmut and the death of Hatshepsut, who became obese in her later years and died as a result of what forensic archaeologists now believe were complications brought on by diabetes, went on to become one of the 18th dynasty's most remarkable golden rulers. His campaigns and treaties, as well as his own building projects, elevated Tutmosis III to the status of any of the other great pharaohs. His deeds after the death of Hatshepsut are not as pertinent to this text, but could fill volumes on their very own. By the way, he was about 29 years old. He was 2 or 3 when his father died, and he was the rightful pharaoh, and Hatshepsut took over. And he was about 29 to 30 when he actually took the throne. And he ruled for almost 40 years, 2 of his final years as co-regent with his son. And June says her story is like Empress Wu Zetian of China, who assumed the throne, wore male clothing, and her statues were also destroyed. Yeah, it's very close. And it's a lot. I like to liken the reign of Hatshepsut to the reign of Elizabeth I of England, who was the woman in the male role, who had all the factionalizing around her, but who brought peace and prosperity. Next section is Senenmut, the hereditary crowned prince of Egypt. Let me just see where we are in this chapter, because I said this is a long-ass chapter. Let's just see where we end up here. Okay, it's 159. I'm on 140. We got 10 pages left. So we've read 2/3 of the chapter in about an hour. So we're good. Let's continue on. Senenmut, the hereditary crown prince of Egypt. Now listen to this in the biblical passage in Exodus. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them in their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw 2 Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. It says he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now, let's cut to the quick. Senenmut favored courtier to Pharaoh Hatshepsut, is the very same man we know as Moses, traditional author of the Old Testament book of Exodus and the other 4 books of the Pentateuch. Boom, period. The previous excerpts from Exodus provide some pretty strong evidence. And in my own mind, this is how I see things unfolding for Moses at that exact moment. And I fictionalized a bit here, just let the imagination run. I took the dagger in my hand, and without even considering the ramifications of who was watching, I clutched the back of the taskmaster's neck and yanked him off balance, at the same time thrusting the blade deep into his kidney. He turned and looked at me in horror, recognizing me, eyes wide, mouth agape, but unable to scream. He dropped his whip into the sand. His hand attempted some defensive posture, but I closed my forearm around his throat, drawing his sweaty, stinking body up against my own, and twisted the dagger up and deeper into the underside of his rib cage, piercing his liver and probably the base of his lung. He let out a wispy, chuttering final breath while staring off into nothing as his ka departed his body. When his lifeless carcass slumped, I loosened my hold and let him slide to the ground. A fresh heart for Amit to consume, as there is no doubt that the heart of a man of such cruelty would certainly be found by Anubis to outweigh the feather of Mot. I shifted a single step backward and sat down in the sand, staring at the lifeless form crumpled at my feet. Perhaps it is not mine to judge, but am I not Senenmut, my mother's brother? Am I not son of Hebrew blood? Have I not been made brother to the great mother of Egypt, the personification of the gods on earth? Hatshepsut, my one true friend and my one true love. Did she not draw me from the Nile and fashion me for a prince of Egypt? Am I not her appointed hereditary crown prince? And have I not witnessed enough of the abuse of these people, so hated by her father and her grandfather, my people, the people of my blood, whom I let see downtrodden every day at the behest of old blood feuds and even older prejudices of enemies long past? As I sit here in this sand, I vow to Amun, to Mot, to Ra, that this corpse at my feet be buried here in obscurity, not only to hide the brashness of my anger, but that his Ba never again find his Ka. And let that damned son of a lesser woman, that other Pharaoh of deposed obscurity, never know of this deed, so that when I ever rise to the power of the throne, I will end this bitter enslavement forever. Let inhumanity know inhumanity, and death to those who would rule from bitterness and cruelty. And may I protect my king, who will ever be my queen, from any and all who would ask and seek her downfall. There is historical data that would lead us not to draw this conclusion. But there is also an incredible amount of circumstantial evidence that leads me to believe that these men were the same man, Moses and Senenmut. Sorry, I got clunky in reading that. Moses is a perplexing historical character. And yes, I say historical, because I believe there's no reason to doubt his existence in real history simply because he's the predominantly mentioned in the books of faith. But even more perplexing than Moses is the event inextricably linked to his name, the Exodus. And even though I put out the theory, it is vapid and empty without creating at least a plausible basis on which to apply the legend. Dating Moses is the easy part, depending on which dating system and chronology of kings you engage. But proving his existence is nearly impossible without speculative extrapolation and attribution based not on first-hand evidence, as that does not exist anywhere, but on secondary evidence, which builds plausibility to the story. Plausibility is the key word. According to the biblical narrative and rabbinic tradition, Moses grew up in the royal courts of Egypt, the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. He was born to a Hebrew couple of the tribe of Levi the eventual priestly caste of Israelites, they and all the Hebrews were, according to the book of Exodus, slaves to the Pharaoh of Egypt, and had been for some 350 years since their original family migrated from Canaan to Egypt during a time of famine. Now, the next section, Solomon's Temple, is the key. If someone's going to state a date for any event in the history of Israel, then they can't provide that date in isolation. This is to say that if someone uses the Bible to demonstrate that their date for something is correct, then you have to check to see if that date is supported by all of surrounding history and the surrounding biblical chronology. Just about every academic alters the biblical data wherever and whenever they choose. If the Bible is written by qualified commentators, then we ought to be able to conclude that the chronological information contained within it ought to be as trustworthy as any other ancient record, and its failure to synchronize results from our failure to correctly apply the information. When was Solomon's temple commenced? 970 BC. When was Solomon's temple completed? 964 BC. When was Solomon's temple destroyed? 586 BC. And this is by R.P. Benedict, rabbinic scholar. Now, although there are many theories surrounding the dating of Moses and the Exodus, our focus remains in the middle of the 15th century BCE, placing the event of the Great Exodus in 1446 BCE, during the 5th year of the reign of Amenhotep II. I arrive at this date based on an Old Testament reference that includes an event that is considered to be a rock-solid date in history, the founding of Temple 1 in Jerusalem, also known as Solomon's Temple. Though there is a great dispute over the very existence of King Solomon of Israel, there is no dispute over the dating of the temple attributed to him, at least among those who believe that the Temple 1 was an historical and archaeological fact. And there is some dispute over its archaeological existence at all. But if the biblical writers and chroniclers are to be trusted, the median date of the founding of Temple 1, give or take a disputed 3 to 6 years in either direction, is 966 BC. In the Hebrew Bible's book of 1 Kings 6:1, it states that on the day that Solomon founded the temple in Jerusalem, it had been 480 years since the Exodus. So take 966 BC, take 966, plus the 480 years, and you end up at 1446 BCE. In the 480th year, 480 is in the Hebrew. The Septuagint says 440. After the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. That's Solomon. Is it really that easy? If the biblical narrative is accurate, 480 years had passed since the Exodus, and Temple 1 was built in 966 BC. That gives us 1446 BC as the date of the Exodus, the date when Moses was about 80 years old, according to the Jewish story. If that is so, then Moses would have been born in 1526 BCE under the reign of Tutmosis I, whose only daughter was a young girl named Matkare Hatshepsut. She bore the distinctive title, singular title, of Pharaoh's daughter, meaning Pharaoh's only female heir. If it was the remarkable Hatshepsut who found Moses in the basket in the Nile, and she indeed raised him as her own, Moses would have been an amazing man in any right, all based on that simple fact alone. Dr. Charles Ailing, Egyptologist and chair of history at the University of Northwestern in Minnesota, has a description of the educational curriculum for royal children in Royal Educational System of 18th Dynasty Egypt. He writes that teachers and royal tutors were selected from officials of the land who were favorites of the reigning monarch. These royal students would study hieroglyphics and other scripts, copying and memorizing lengthy lists of words, dates, and names. They also studied the foreign languages of their world. Oratory skills were considered extremely important, so they received heavy attention during the years of formal education. The ability to write well was also placed at a very high value. If young Moses was Hatshepsut's adopted son, he would have been educated in the royal school of 18th dynasty Egypt, the most superior form of education available in the world at that time. By the way, this is a rendition of Solomon's Temple in 966 BC. This is about what they said it would have looked like, something like that. And that's where the Mosque of Omar, the Dome of the Rock, sits in Jerusalem today. All right. So let's move on here. This would certainly qualify the biblical description of his education. I'm holding this all wrong right now. As well as his ability and competency to stand before a pharaoh and present sterling oratory, even though he originally protested God's calling him to return to Egypt, with the argument that he was slow of speech. Remember when he said that at the burning bush scene? Not a gifted speaker. And most certainly, his capability to write the first 5 books of the Bible of the Old Testament is evidenced through that he was schooled, evidenced enough that he was schooled in the higher caliber. It is doubtful by evidence of his writings that he forgot any of his education while living as a sheikh in the back country of Sinai's Midian. I want to show you this. There is a picture here. This picture is of the top of a stele that's broken off at the top of Serebet el Khadim. And I'll tell you about that in a second here. Right here, you have, I'm looking at it backwards in my screen. Hold on. Yeah, there you go. This is, and get here. Hatshepsut is standing right here with her hand outstretched. And this is the god Amun standing here. Now over here, however, you have the goddess Hathor. You can tell by the disc and the horns atop her head. And even though it's broken away, there's a figure of a man here who is Tutmosis III. And we know this because you can see in here, you see this little triangle right here? That's the symbol for king. And then Hatshepsut's name down beneath in hieroglyph. That's who she is. I'm sorry, here she is over here. King, I'm looking at it backwards. The king, the triangle, the Ankh, and the cartouche of Hatshepsut. Over here, it's harder to see here, but you see the cartouche of Tutmosis III and the little triangular shape, the pyramid, tall pyramid shape of king. This is one of the only stones left that speaks to the co-regency between Hatshepsut and Tutmosis I, and of course the gods. Now, what's interesting about this, John Ward, and there's a little story here. John Ward and I went to the little mountain Serebet el Khadim. And at Serebet el Khadim in the Sinai, that's the mountain that we believe is the mountain of God mentioned in the Old Testament, the Mount Sinai. And we're there staying as guests of the sheikh of the area, Sheikh Salim Barakat. He put us up in a 120-year-old Bedouin tent with the fire in the middle of the tent, and we slept in there, and his sons slept as guards outside in the sand, wrapped in camel hair blankets. And there was a full moon that night that we were there. I mean, it was just amazing. And we'd walk out and go look at the mountain, Serebet el Khadim. And we climbed that mountain the next day. But that night, sitting around the fire, we had Mustafa Rezik, who was the inspector general for the Ministry of Antiquities of that region in the Sinai. And he wanted to know what my story was and why we were there. And I told him why we were there, climbing the mountain. John told him, of course. And he looks at me over the fire and he says, Scotty, he's have a surprise for you on the top of the mountain tomorrow. And when we got up there, he showed me this stele that he had uncovered very recently. And it's one of the very few evidences of Hatshepsut and Tutmosis III that's left from antiquity. And if you go here in my videos, my Egyptian Adventures, I think it's called, the section, scroll over and you'll see, I think, a picture of me leaning over and I'm looking at this big stele. You can watch that, and I point all these hieroglyphs out on that stele. It's fun to watch, just fun to see it. And that's all sitting at the top of the mountain out in the middle of the Sinai Desert. That's stele. All right, so here we are. Let's get back into it. As we already know, Hatshepsut bore no royal heirs. She did have two daughters, and they both died. She bore no royal heirs to succeed her on the throne, save for her daughter Nefruri, who died around the age of 16. I'm sorry, one daughter. I said two. Who died around the age of 16, sometime between year 11 and 16 of her mother's reign. Hatshepsut had been married to her own weak and sickly brother, Tutmosis II, who died leaving his very young son, Tutmosis III. Hatshepsut became co-regent with her dead husband's son, then named herself Pharaoh, and dominated his reign until the day she died around 1483 BC. An interesting speculation, however, is that Hatshepsut, having a deep-set hatred of her brother, husband, found in Moses someone who she could groom to take the throne in her place. This was Senenmut. She pushed Tutmosis III completely out of the picture, but because there was only a maximum of 7 to 10 years in age between Moses and Hatshepsut, it has been speculated that she meant for him to simply be retained as her valued counselor and a failsafe should she die. When Moses was 40 years old, according to the biblical narrative, he and his royal entourage encounter an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave. In anger, Moses struck out and murdered the taskmaster. Fearing this would become known, Moses fled Egypt and ran to the land of Midian, where he became a shepherd and married the daughter of a pagan high priest of the region. Then his story falls silent for 40 more years until his return to Egypt post-burning bush Epiphany. In the meantime, one must wonder what really happened behind the scenes of the biblical story. It's my contention that a likely candidate for Moses during his 40 years of life in the Egyptian palace was this man named Senenmut, who was the tutor to Hatshepsut's daughter, Nefruri, as well as Hatshepsut's most trusted advisor. Keeping in mind, a royal tutor was not necessarily a scholarly educator type. They were generally men of military accomplishment and some importance of nobility. According to Jewish traditional stories in the in the Mishnah, Moses had been a fiercely ambitious general under the Pharaoh. Senenmut lived under the gracious and benevolent eye of Hatshepsut, some accounts even hailing to their relationship as possible lovers, despite the nearly 10-year age difference between them. Senenmut was granted nearly 90 titles bestowed on him by Hatshepsut, including hereditary crown prince of Egypt, count, sole companion, master of all people, chief of the whole land, royal vizier, and chief royal architect. A significant title she bestowed on Senenmut was in changing of his name and changing it to Senenmut, which means, by definition, mother's brother. In essence, it was a title elevating a son to the status of equal with his mother, allowing him to claim equal status of brother to the gods with his pharaonic parent. A more simplistic defining of his name is very similar, but less personal, meaning the mother of Egypt elevates you as a brother in equal status. Or was this a name title she granted Moses as he grew? learned and became her lover and closest political ally. Remember, this is the girl who found him in the Nile and adopted him. That doesn't mean they acted as mother and brother. They were very close in age. Well, there was 10 years difference. If she was 10, Moses was born. If that's the oldest she was, she could have been as young as 7, is the speculation. And when Moses returns to her around age 4 or 5, she's 12. And she takes him on and names him her son. But as he grows, they become lovers. And there's a hell of a lot of evidence in Egyptian history to prove that those two were lovers. And he was her favorite in that sense. And we got into some of that in the past. We might get into some of that some more. So let's look at this. Let's see. Charter up here, Wisconsin. Okay, I'm just taking a glance at what is going on over there, talking about stuff. Let's see. Jama, I just want to see what you had to say here. Just a little back. He supposedly put hot coals in his mouth as a baby. I think that was one of the different minor prophets who did that, Jama. I remember a story of that. He was told not to, but that's cool. If I remember, it had something to do with his future, like he was saying he would overtake a king, but I can remember the details. Okay. And we'll leave that at that. Let's just move on. Senenmut's royal appointments included chief steward, who conducted all the works of the king, one who heard the hearing alone in the privy council, master of the palace. Now, by the way, you're getting a picture of what this guy was and what he did. These are all the things. He heard the hearing alone in the privy council, master of the palace, real confidant of the king, privy councillor of the right hand, chief steward of the Princess Nefruri. His administrative titles included wearer of the royal seal, steward of Amun, overseer of the granary of Amun, overseer of the storehouse of Amun, overseer of the works of Amun, overseer of all works of the house of silver, overseer of the gardens of Amun, overseer of the cattle of Amun, chief of the peasant serfs of Amun, overseer of the temples of Nate. And Senenmut's religious titles included prophet of Amun, prophet of Mat, chief of the prophets of Montu and Hermonthis. Hermonthis. Now, I'm going to read a passage here from, I've got a footnote here, so I'm not quite sure where this came from, whose book this is. But it says, it's almost certain, scholars agree, that Senenmut, the official overseer of the works at Deir el-Bahre, was the mastermind behind, if not the actual architect, of that temple. He had most likely begun his climb to power during the reign of Thutmose II, when he was the appointed tutor to Hatshepsut's daughter, Nefruri. But his influence soared with Hatshepsut's ascension to the throne. In time, he acquired some 93 titles, the most prestigious of which was Great Steward of Amun, the god of Thebes, which put him in charge of all of Karnak's building and business activities. Many of Senenmut's monuments to himself, some 25, a staggering number for a non-royal, mention his exceptional access to the throne. He was a true confidant of the Pharaoh, and one upon whose utterances the Lord relied. But earlier scholars believed that Senenmut was the real force behind Hatshepsut's rule. Not even a woman of the worst or of the most virile character could have attained such a pinnacle of success without masculine support, quote unquote, wrote historian Alan Gardner in 1961. Has now been largely discounted by experts as a woeful underestimation of the woman Hatshepsut. But somewhere around 1446 to 1445 or to 1485, Senenmut disappears completely off the Egyptian scene. Incidentally, if you're keeping up on the mathematics, if Moses was born in 1526, he would have turned 40 around 1486, the same year he is said to have murdered the Egyptian taskmaster and fled Egypt. and the same approximate year that Senenmut completely disappears from Egypt. Whether he was murdered or fled for some other political reason, if he was indeed the same man as Moses, the chronology of his life is a perfect match. And the fact that he leaves without anything ever being said about it in Egyptian record might be an indicator of who he truly is. It's my contention that there is obviously much more at play than what we read in the Hebrew scripture. And I speculate that because Moses could have been raised to take this adoptive mother's place on the throne of Egypt, he had a vociferous political foe in her stepson, Tutmosis III. And I believe it was this murdering of the Egyptian taskmaster that gave Tutmosis III the political opportunity to off his rival as well as his hated mother's favorite. The dates fit, the timeline works, but there simply is no proof beyond speculation built upon circumstantial acts of historical figures. And when Moses is commanded by God to return to the Pharaoh of Egypt and demand the release of the pharaohs, what is his first refusal? I can't go back there. The Pharaoh is seeking my life. This is 40 years later after the fact. Why, after 40 years in hiding, was Moses still worried that the Pharaoh of Egypt was seeking his life? Was it because he murdered a taskmaster? Or did it have more to do with the factionalism that may have existed between Tutmosis III and Hatshepsut? She trusted in his abilities enough to place him in charge of her armies, but he didn't ever seem to make a move to depose her from what should have been his throne. Perhaps Tutmosis III was biding his time. Or perhaps it was because Hatshepsut had garnered too much favor with the people, or perhaps her priests, counselors, and other courtiers were far too powerfully aligned with her. And now when Moses is asked to return to Egypt, this man is on the throne, at least for 2 more years, as co-regent with his son, Amenhotep II. And by the way, as Tutmosis III being the co-regent, where the biblical passage is the Pharaoh sought to take his life, I think that's because he is still recognized in that capacity. And Moses, when writing these things, didn't make the distinction. By the way, this is the sacred lake of Tutmosis III at Karnak Temple. And I've got some other pictures of that. But his temple is right over here on that side of the lake. And I'm standing just off the end of Amenhotep II, his son, his temple there at Karnak. And that's the sacred pond or sacred lake in front of Tutmosis III's temple at Karnak. So, whatever the reasons may be, there might have been a constant opportunistic plotting wherever there was a way to make subtle attacks from the sidelines without making an overt show of discord or rebellion. And Moses, Senenmut's killing of the taskmaster may have been just the animus Tutmosis III needed to eradicate his mother's favorite, her favorite courtier and chosen lover. It may also have been a cover story for much greater events that would lead to Moses fleeing Egypt, because as a member of the royal household, he would not have had to flee for the killing of a man who was in essence one step above a slave. That could have been easily forgotten. So why did he run? That's an unanswerable question outside speculation. Now, I have a theory, and let me tell it to you. I'll finish. We're just right here, and that's the end of this chapter, right here under my thumb. Let me finish this, and I'll give you some theories I have about this. When Moses did return to Egypt as an old man after 40 years in hiding, he had the court of Pharaoh Amenhotep II living in fear of his words. His old royal training kicked in, and he had them living in awe of his very shadow. I think this is because he may have been recognized for who he had once been in those alabaster courts of the royal house of Egypt. And this may also be the reasoning behind Amenhotep's eradication of not only Hatshepsut's images, but Senenmut's images as well. Hatshepsut remained a symbol of his father's of her father's early deposition from the throne of Egypt. And even after her death, Tutmosis III had very little he could do to remedy that injustice until certain factions had died off. Amenhotep, brash, young, and egotistical, took the matter into his own hands, and in order to establish his complete and total reign over Egypt, removed all the images of Hatshepsut, as well as the man who stood by her side. Now, after 40 years, he returned to complete the humiliation. Exodus 7, 1 through 6 reads, Then the Lord said to Moses, See, I have made you like a god to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron will be your prophet. You are to say everything I command you, and your brother Aaron is to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of his country. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in Egypt, he will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt with my mighty acts of judgment. I will bring out my divisions, my people, the Israelites, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out of it. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded them. Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. Now, what most of us fail to understand, both in the academic arena and the realm of personal belief, is that the Bible, in addition to being a religious book of faith, is also an extensive historical document, which, when combined with extra-biblical ancient Israelite and Egyptian documents, provides far more chronological and historical information than you find in any other ancient civilization, whose records are more favorably treated as truth in our ever-increasingly anti-religious world. You don't have to accept the religious part, if you so choose, but it is imperative that you see the Bible as it truly is, a series of historical documents blended with matters of faith. Is it always correct? No. But it is pure fabrication. But is it pure fabrication simply on the basis that it is a book of faith? Absolutely not. And that's the end of this very long chapter. And I want to hit a couple of things before I let you go. Chapter 8, by the way, is called The Aftermath. It's part of the Hapu thread, John Ward's thread that we're going to pick up tomorrow night. Now, there's something interesting, I think, about all of this stuff. There's so much you have to speculate. There's speculative conjecture. Moses' name finished been a position in the Egyptian throne. Not sure what you're saying there, TT. Moses' name finished been a position in the. Are you talking about Moses, like in Tutmosis, Ramses, which is Ra-Moses? Moses was a name that was part of a common name amongst many pharaohs. Amos was Amoses. So don't let us go. It's Friday, says Lewis. Yeah, it's Friday for another hour or so. There is no Rocky Stucci Situation Room tonight, by the way, because our show was this morning at midnight, our Friday show. So there isn't one tonight. Moses, I don't think, it doesn't mean magician. Moses means drawn out, taken from the water of life, and so on, and things like that. There might be some connotations, but I've never heard magician as a direct definition of Moses. So get this picture that's going on here. If Moses is indeed Senenmut, and he murders an Egyptian, probably a nothing thing for an Egyptian official of Senenmut's status as Grand Vizier, High Priest of Amun, all of these titles, to murder a taskmaster, and the Pharaoh's going to take his life. I think that this taskmaster was more than probably a lowly, one step above a slave, a guy with a whip or a rod beating the slaves. I don't think that's who he was. I think he was somebody probably much higher up the chain in the whole taskmastery chain of command. I also think that, as you see in politics today, that this guy, whoever he was, this taskmaster, was latched onto by one of the political factions that would have found Senenmut, or Moses, being somebody that they did not want to have as close to the throne as he was, or as close to the queen, Pharaoh, as he was, Hatshepsut. And so they found a way to take him out. And that's why they sought his life. I don't think it's because he killed a lowly taskmaster. I think it's because that taskmaster was either part of the political faction or factionalizing that took place in the court of Hatshepsut, or they used his death when they found out about it to displace Senenmut. Now, it's very interesting also that Senenmut, a man who is part of Hatshepsut's household, I think when she gave him the name Senenmut, remember, mother's brother, I think she was elevating, she was separating. He's no longer my son. His mother elevates him to brother, to the gods with me. I think when she did that, she broke that chain there, but she made him part of the royal house. She was grooming him in a sense, possibly to take over as Pharaoh, but most certainly he was the Grand Vizier, Pharaoh in the place of Pharaoh. And some people probably didn't like this. And while there was peace, and the rightful Pharaoh Thutmose III never made a move against her, despite being general of all her armies, he held off. But when Senenmut was found out to have murdered the Egyptian, I think they latched onto it to get rid of him, take him out of the picture. But he runs instead. He flees. And for somebody as important as Senenmut was in Egyptian history, a man who left behind 2 unused tombs, there is absolutely no reference anywhere as to why he disappeared around age 40. There's no fanfare. There's no celebration of his life. There's no mummy that is preserved. And if there was, it's gone now. I don't think there was, though, because I think he was Moses, and I think he fled the country. And then when Thutmose III, when Hatshepsut dies, he takes over as his rightful stead as Pharaoh around age 29 or 30. Starts striking some of her images off the wall. I think that and he left off very early. It was just to establish who he was. It was his son 40 years later who finished the job. I think the one who probably made sure that Thutmose III had left behind documents saying that she was a lying bitch, things like that. But there were so many things about Senenmut and Hatshepsut that proved that they were very close, that they were lovers. And from the paintings on the walls of the workers' cave up above her temple, where it shows Senenmut shagging Hatshepsut from behind, which was a well-known thing, obviously, 3,500 years ago. And so, and Jama, his name was stripped from history. And they found in a pit 9 of his statues buried in a pit. Several of them where he's holding the young Nefertari, the princess. I also, by the way, now that I'm mentioning her, I've got a theory. I've got a theory that I put out there. There is a statue of Senenmut. It's in the book here. It's this one. Let me show you. This is in the color section, so it'll be a little easier to make out here. This statue right here. If you see this is Senenmut and the young princess Nefertari. Oh, and by the way, there's the picture of it. It's painted on the walls of Senenmut shagging Hatshepsut, who's bent over a pile of bricks, and he's shagging her from behind. And that's up in the workers' cave. It's 3,500 years old, that graffiti. But there is Senenmut right there. And I want you to take a close look at him. That's Senenmut, but he doesn't look like any of the other statues of Senenmut that exist. Senenmut was a little more square-jawed, a little harsher nose. Of course, part of his nose is missing here. And this statue of Senenmut actually looks a hell of a lot like Hatshepsut when she's younger. But it says in the inscriptions, there's hieroglyphs going down the side of the base of this statue the hieroglyphs stating that this is Senenmut. And by the way, this is Hatshepsut in some of her statuary. I want you to note her eyes here. So let's see if I can get it lined up here so I can even see it. This is what will help when I get my software installed. So there's Hatshepsut. I want you to note her eyes. They show her with the almond-shaped eyes, the rounded face. Even on this statue, by the way, you can still see some of the red pigment with which they painted her skin color. And this is the statue that you can see it back here along these. It was in every one of these little pillars had one of these statues there. So that's Hatshepsut. Now look again at the picture of Senenmut's statue. Right here. Take a look at that. Now look at the eyes. Take note of the eyes, the almond-shaped eyes, and so on. Makes it look like a woman. That's a very feminine looking statue. Now there's a picture of where have I got? I've got a picture of Senenmut, his statue in here somewhere. Hang on, and I'll show you this. So let me just find it. It's probably later back here. Yeah, it's not, of course. Going back up. There it is. Now, very hard to see because this is in the black and white. Sorry again for my lack of technology. But this is a statue of Senenmut, again with is Neferuri in this one? No, she's not. Hathor. But look at the face here on this statue. Quite a bit different. And there are other statues of him where he's almost got a hook nose. And if you look at the graphic for tonight's show here on YouTube, you'll see there's a picture. That's actually a hand-drawn picture of Senenmut with a grid where somebody was being taught how to draw and render his face in ink. And it's there, and that's been preserved. So here's the deal. Here's my theory. I have not heard anybody put forward this theory yet. And you might know where I'm going already. Yeah, I think she was kind of hot, Lewis. Hatshepsut and Senenmut were lovers. We know that much. Now, as lovers, here's the thinking, is that the child Neferuri is not Thutmose II's child with Hatshepsut. Remember, he's her husband, her brother, who dies. I think it's a possibility that Neferuri may have been Senenmut's child with Hatshepsut. No proof of this. Pure speculation on my part. But for me, for Senenmut to have built a statue of himself with his inscription on it, but to make that statue look like Hatshepsut, the woman, the queen he honored and with whom he was in love, and to be holding the child, is something very telling. So I'm looking into some of this. There's some speculation for you right there. I think there's a lot of speculation around these stories. So the first statue, why was it identified as Senenmut? His name is carved in all of them. And the dating on the names. The hieroglyphs are there along the side. And you can see them all as they are built right into it. If I show you this bust that's sitting behind me here, let me pull this off of here. It's heavy. Now, that's how heavy that is. This is the bust that John Ward had made for me of Senenmut. Let me just bring this down. All right. Now, it's not an exact representation because they can't. The artisans are not allowed to make exact representations because the security in Egypt, you can't take these things out of Egypt. So they make them a little squatter looking and things like that. So this shows you Senenmut and Neferuri, the young princess. But you see here the hieroglyphs. On the original statue, this is how where the hieroglyphs were put in, all along here and all down the sides and so on. And so there's no hieroglyphs on the sides of this one. But this is how they found them. And this is how they identified this as Senenmut when they first found it, is that his name is all in here. So, and down the sides. So, yeah, it's a little hard to see these. These aren't, I don't think he's got all the inscription in here either. Because I look on this particular one, even looking in the reflection there in the mirrored image on my screen, I don't see the cartouche of Senenmut in there. But it would have been down along the sides and down on the base and so on. So that's where you saw this stuff. So there you go. Let me get this back in place. John lugged this here from Egypt in his backpack for me back in 2013. All right, hang on. That's a monster. There we go. All right. Turn that back out of the way. All right. So that is limestone. So what that was made out of. So heavy piece. And this was made from a chunk of stone that John found at the quarries of Hatshepsut out behind the house of, it's not in his backyard, but if you go past the house of John Carter over by the Valley of the Kings and you keep going out into the wilderness a little ways, we actually walked it. We went back in there looking for the quarries of Hatshepsut, which are back there. That's where it is. And he found this stone and he brought it back. And keep in mind, these aren't like guarded sites, and these things are all out in the open in the wild. And so John just went back there and he grabbed a stone and brought it to a local artisan in Luxor who made that. And so it's very cool. Yeah, it's heavy. So there's lots of theories about Senenmut, but I tend to believe I want to say with 98% certainty that Senenmut is Moses. And a lot of the facts fit. And this ties into some of the supernatural stuff that I've encountered, which I don't write about in this book, and I can't as an academic. But I talk about those in different arenas. I've talked about it here. So there's all kinds of, I think I did something on Senenmut as a ghost story, and it's somewhere here on my YouTube back a few months ago. So you could find that. So TT, what are you oh-mying? What did I miss? Makes sense of why I'm saying that's a devoted friend to carry that. Yeah, it certainly is. Devoted friend and John. I can't remember what he said it weighed. I haven't weighed it in a long time. So, but yes, I don't know what the oh my is, if it's responding to that or not. But there you go. That's the chapter on Senenmut. I could just keep going on forever, but we've been going for 2 hours now. And it's probably time to give you all a break from me talking at you. Keep your fingers crossed that one of these days, maybe over the weekend, I can get my new software package working. Thank you, Audrey. Yes, go to scottallenroberts.com. Take a look at some of my other videos here. You'll see some of the neat stuff related to some of these stories. And it's about 30 pounds. I think we thought it was like 35 pounds at one point. So, yeah, it's not light. It's like carrying a small child around. So, folks, I want to thank you for being here. Louis, thanks for being here. June, Michelle, Audrey, of course, Audrey, TT, John, great having you here tonight. Jeannie, good to have you. June, Ron Frisbee, I didn't see you slip in. Good to see you, brother Ron. And let's see, Gemma, good to have you here. And I'm just looking to see if there's anybody else I did not say hey to. Spartan, good to see you. So I'm glad you're here tonight. Charter internet up here in Wisconsin. Must have got spiked by the storm. Yeah, we were worried a little bit about that at the beginning of this program. Buffy Granger, good to see you. I didn't see you when you slipped in. And Suze, good to have you here. And if I missed anybody in this whole thing, pardon me, but I want to thank you all for being here. You make my heart burst with 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 love and thankfulness and joy and all that good stuff without sounding too maudlin. I appreciate your being here and supporting what I do. Spread the word and like my page. Subscribe if you're not subscribed. I'm guessing most of you are. And that's it. If you got any questions, send them to me. You can make comments, ask me questions and open comments down below the videos. Like the video on your way out. Or if you want to go back in and see some of the other videos, go back into the Egyptian Adventures section and see my video on that stele stone top from Serabit El-Khanim. It's just interesting to look at. And at that, I'm going to say goodnight. I'm going to say thanks for being here. I appreciate it. And I'll see you again next time. It won't be tomorrow or Sunday. If I slip in here on Saturday or Sunday, it's just going to be to do something completely different. We'll pick up with the reading on Monday night with chapter 8. And we'll see you then. Thanks again. Good night.